Don't call me your sister. The existence of you and this child is the biggest stain on our family. The merciless slap from my own biological sister landed straight on my heavily scarred face. In the middle of the crowded cafe, Jessica gleefully trampled on my dignity, completely ignoring little Ava, who was clutching the hem of my shirt, cowering in fear. Taking the full brunt of the pain from my own blood, I stood rooted to the spot. Not a single tear fell. I stared right at her with a suffocating dead silence. That composure was like pouring gas on a fire. The powerful sister whipped around, arrogantly barking at her burly husband. "John, are you just going to stand there and watch your wife get disrespected? Deal with this failure of a sister right now." But John didn't step forward. The moment his eyes locked onto my mangled, scarred face, every drop of color instantly drained from his own. The massive man suddenly stumbled back exactly 3 steps, his pupils dilating in sheer terror, stuttering out a sentence that froze even the arrogant Jessica in her tracks. "Impossible. Is that Captain Watson?" Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. The name Watson hit my eardrums like a concussion grenade. The cafe, the staring crowd, my sister's twisted face, all of it dissolved. The sound dragged my mind violently out of that room and hurled it 10 years backwards, straight into the blinding white fluorescent lights of a military trauma ward. I remembered waking up to an agonizing, searing heat that consumed the entire left side of my face, as if someone had poured molten iron directly across my cheekbone and left it there to cool into my skin. The sharp, sterile smell of heavy antiseptics burned my nostrils so intensely my eyes watered. Military surgeons in green scrubs stood at the foot of my metal-framed bed, their voices hushed. They called me a hero. They told me the shrapnel I absorbed when our Humvee hit an IED on a dusty road outside Fallujah had saved the lives of my entire unit. Every single soldier in that vehicle walked away breathing because the left side of my face caught what would have shredded through the cabin. I slowly raised a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the thick, coarse gauze wrapping my skull. The texture felt alien, like touching someone else's body. Despite the blinding physical agony radiating from my jaw to my temple, I felt a strange, quiet sense of pride swelling deep in my chest. The entire ward treated my wound like a badge of supreme valor. Nurses adjusted my IV with gentle reverence. A 2-star general personally pinned a Purple Heart to my hospital gown, while I was still too drugged to fully understand the ceremony. I naively believed that if the United States Marine Corps honored my sacrifice with medals and salutes, my own wealthy family would finally look at me with the same pride. I convinced myself the worst was over. I had survived Fallujah. I had cheated death. I thought the war was finished. I had absolutely no idea that the real psychological slaughterhouse was waiting for me at home, dressed in designer clothes and smelling like expensive perfume. When the military transport finally dropped me off at our sprawling family estate a month later, there was no welcome banner. No balloons, no embrace. The massive wrought iron gates swung open in dead, eerie silence. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my boots. As I dragged my duffel bag toward the front entrance, my heavy combat boots thudding against the polished stone. I stepped into the grand marble foyer, and the sound of my uneven footsteps bounced off the high ceilings and disappeared into emptiness. I expected my parents to rush forward and wrap their arms around me. Instead, they stood by the parlor doors, averting their eyes, entirely whispering nervously to the household staff, as if coordinating how to manage an uninvited guest. Then my sister descended the grand spiral staircase. The heavy, suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume instantly assaulted my senses, aggressively masking the sterile, clinical smell still lingering on my bandages. She didn't ask if I was in pain. She didn't cry tears of relief that I had survived a war zone. She didn't even glance at the cane keeping me upright. She locked her eyes directly onto my freshly unbandaged, jagged cheek, and her perfectly manicured face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered revulsion. She recoiled, a visible physical step backward, as if the sight of my wound was contagious. She didn't even speak directly to me. She turned sharply to the head butler and issued a cold, sterile command. "Keep her in the guest house during the charity gala this weekend. I won't have my guests looking at that." That was my homecoming. No hero's welcome, no grateful tears, just instructions to hide me like a piece of damaged furniture before the important people arrived. I gripped the heavy canvas strap of my duffel bag so tightly, I felt the rough material bite into my palm. My parents said nothing. My father kept his eyes fixed on the grandfather clock in the hallway. My mother smoothed down the front of her silk blouse over and over, as if the repetitive motion could erase the discomfort of having a scarred daughter standing in her pristine foyer. The emotional knife twisted exponentially deeper the following morning. I walked into the main dining room determined to sit with my family and force them to acknowledge my existence. The absurdly large mahogany table was set with heavy silver cutlery crystal water glasses and a centerpiece of white lilies that probably cost more than my monthly military pay. My sister sat at the head, scrolling through her phone with one hand, a porcelain coffee cup in the other. As I pulled out a chair, the wooden legs scraping against the hardwood floor, she slammed her porcelain coffee cup onto the saucer. The sharp clink echoed violently through the massive room, cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Ever since I returned with a ruined face, Jessica always threw looks of absolute contempt at me, treating me like a stain that disgraced our lineage. She stared directly at my scar, her voice dripping with venomous disgust. "You are terrifying my friends and ruining the corporate brand." She sneered aggressively, slicing her steak without breaking eye contact, the serrated knife scraping against the porcelain plate. "I will pay for unlimited plastic surgery. I will hire the best doctors in the country. But until then, you stay completely out of sight, and you never mention your disgusting military service to anyone in our circle again." I gripped the edge of my wooden chair under the table, my knuckles turning bone white. The absolute silence from my parents sitting directly across the table was a deafening confirmation of their agreement. My father continued chewing. My mother reached for her water glass and took a long, deliberate sip, her eyes focused intently on the lily centerpiece. They were complicit. Not through cruelty, but through cowardice. And cowardice, I learned that morning, cuts just as deep. I stood perfectly still in that dining room, letting the sheer toxicity of her words wash over me like a chemical burn. In that precise fraction of a second, I realized my own bloodline valued a flawless public aesthetic far more than my survival. More than the blood I spilled for this country. More than the nerves permanently destroyed in my cheek. I didn't argue. I didn't scream, and I absolutely did not shed a single tear to beg for their twisted approval. I pivoted sharply on my heel, executing a flawless military turn, and marched straight up the stairs to my lavish bedroom. I bypassed the closets full of designer clothes, the silk robes, the Italian leather shoes that had been gathering dust since before my deployment. I pulled out my single olive drab military duffel bag and packed nothing but basic essentials. 3 sets of clothing. My service medals in their wooden case. A photograph of my unit. I slung the heavy canvas bag over my shoulder, walking past the bewildered maids and my silent, cowardly parents in the hallway. I approached the massive front doors, gripping the cold brass handles with my calloused hands. Pushing them open, I stepped out into the biting, freezing air, actively choosing absolute exile over a life of suffocating pity and hidden shame. I pulled the heavy oak doors shut behind me with a loud, definitive thud, severing my ties to their elite world forever. Nobody followed me. Nobody called my name. The only sound was the crunch of frozen gravel under my boots as I walked away from the only family I had ever known. Transitioning to the civilian world without my family's immense wealth was like trying to breathe underwater. I dropped the prestigious family surname from every form I filled out, and the decorated title of Captain Watson, becoming just Betty, a faceless, invisible worker in a sprawling, unforgiving city. My bank accounts were completely empty, having explicitly refused to accept a single cent of my sister's insulting hush money. Desperate for income, I took grueling overnight shift work at a massive logistics warehouse on the industrial outskirts of town. My hands, which were once highly trained to field strip an M4 rifle in under 30 seconds, were now perpetually blistered and bleeding from hauling heavy wooden crates across concrete floors for 12 hours straight. The physical toll was excruciating, but I swallowed my immense pride and clocked in every single night without complaint. I stood in long, exhausting lines at the cheap grocery store under harsh fluorescent lights, carefully counting loose pennies from a Ziploc bag just to make the rent for my cramped, drafty studio apartment. The smell of cheap paint and mildew permeated my clothes, a stark, violent contrast to the silk sheets and catered meals of the life I had intentionally abandoned. I ate rice and canned beans 5 nights a week and considered it a victory every time I made it to the end of the month with the lights still on. The brutal physical labor was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological endurance required to navigate the civilian public. Job interviewers at corporate offices would take one single look at the massive, jagged scar distorting my face, and their professionally polite expressions would crack. They instantly averted their eyes, suddenly finding an urgent need to shuffle papers quickly, fabricating a polite excuse to show me the door. One hiring manager actually knocked over his own coffee, reaching for a tissue to pretend to sneeze, just to avoid looking at me during the handshake. In the bleak break room at the warehouse, I would sit alone with my cold coffee at the metal folding table in the corner, listening to coworkers whisper loudly behind my back. They wove wild, inaccurate rumors speculating that I was the victim of horrific domestic abuse or a catastrophic car crash. One woman told the shipping supervisor I had probably been attacked with acid by a jealous ex-boyfriend. I never once corrected them. I never told them about Fallujah. I never mentioned the IED, the burning Humvee, or the unit of Marines who owed me their lives. I let them stare, and I let them whisper. Instead of living in that toxic control and pity from my wealthy family, I chose to leave. I chose a simple life, working hard, saving every penny. I channeled every ounce of my frustration into pushing heavier loads and working double shifts, silently proving my worth through undeniable, unrelenting competence rather than physical aesthetics. My supervisor noticed. Within 6 months, he promoted me to lead the night crew, not because he pitied me, but because nobody else moved freight with the precision and speed of a former Marine logistics officer. I survived the crushing weight of poverty by leaning heavily on the only thing that hadn't betrayed me: Marine Corps discipline. Every single morning without fail, I woke up at exactly 5:30 a.m. I didn't own an alarm clock. My internal body clock, forged through years of pre-dawn combat patrols, functioned with absolute unyielding precision. I immediately stepped onto the freezing linoleum floor and carefully made my small bed, folding the cheap blankets with perfect taut military corners. The motion was automatic. My hands creased the fabric the same way they had smoothed the canvas cover on my rack in the barracks at Camp Lejeune, the same way they had tucked a thermal blanket around a wounded corporal in a freezing foxhole outside Fallujah while tracers streaked overhead. I polished my heavy steel-toed work boots until the scuffed leather gleamed under the bare bathroom bulb, and I planned my meager weekly budget in a small, spiral-bound notebook with tactical, unforgiving precision. Every dollar had an assignment. Every expense was justified or eliminated. This relentless mechanical routine became my impenetrable armor. It kept the encroaching, suffocating darkness of PTSD completely at bay, replacing the nightmares with structure, replacing the chaos with order. It was a silent, unglamorous war for financial independence and basic human dignity, fought entirely in the shadows of a city that didn't care if I lived or died. I executed my daily survival like a high-stakes combat mission, because that is exactly what it was. Late at night, when the warehouse shifts finally ended and the city fell quiet outside my single window, I would stand straight up under the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of my tiny bathroom. I would lean over the cracked porcelain sink and run my calloused fingertips slowly over the rigid, uneven, angry red tissue of my left cheek. The physical texture was a daily, visceral reminder of the burning Humvee and the men we nearly lost in the sand. The scar had settled into a permanent topographic map of violence, ridges and valleys carved into my face by white-hot shrapnel. But looking at my reflection in that water-stained mirror, I absolutely refused to let a single tear fall for what I had sacrificed, or for the family that had discarded me like a defective product. I have never regretted this scar. It is a medal of blood, of fire, and of supreme honor. It proved I survived a hell that my arrogant sister couldn't even begin to comprehend from the cushioned leather seat of her chauffeured sedan. I dropped my hand, pivoted sharply on my heel, and turned off the bathroom light, plunging the room into darkness, entirely ready to face another brutal day on my own terms. The civilian world owed me nothing, and I intended to take everything I needed from it anyway. The unexpected arrival of my daughter Ava fundamentally shifted the entire gravitational pull of my universe. She came into my life through a brief, complicated relationship with a fellow veteran who died in a motorcycle accident on a rain-slicked highway before he ever knew I was pregnant. I buried the grief fast and hard, the way I buried everything, and redirected every ounce of energy toward the new mission growing inside me. My rigid 5:30 a.m. wake-up calls were no longer just a strict, punishing military habit to maintain discipline. They transformed into a quiet, sacred labor of profound love. In the dim blue twilight of the early morning, I would quietly slip out of bed, walking barefoot across the cold floorboards to the small kitchen to warm a bottle of milk. The cheap refrigerator hummed rhythmically in the background, a low mechanical drone that sometimes made the hairs on my neck stand up because it sounded like the idle of a diesel generator in a forward operating base. I pushed the reflex down, gripped the warm plastic bottle against my palm, and focused on the gentle steam rising into the cool morning air. I carried the warm bottle back into the bedroom, looking down at the tiny, fragile sleeping child in the crib, who relied entirely on me for her survival. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt I had a true mission again. Not one that required a weapon or a tactical vest. One that required patience, tenderness, and a kind of bravery I had never been trained for. As Ava grew older, she unknowingly became my ultimate, unparalleled savior. She never looked at me and saw the terrifying monster that my sister had vehemently declared me to be. One quiet Sunday morning, as she sat comfortably on my lap, while I read her a picture book about a brave little fox, her tiny, incredibly soft fingers reached up. Without a hint of hesitation or fear, she gently traced the jagged, raised edges of my ruined cheek. She giggled softly, tapping the scar tissue with her fingertip and calling it my magic map. "Mommy, do these lines lead to buried treasure?" she asked softly. I pressed my lips together hard, swallowing the knot that exploded in my throat. That simple, innocent, unconditionally loving acceptance completely shattered the thick, heavy, emotional armor I had spent years building around my heart. Her peace is the only anchor keeping me in this civilian life, helping me bury the bleeding memories of the battlefield and the agonizing pain of being abandoned by my own family. She healed the wounds that no military surgeon or civilian doctor could ever reach. She didn't need medals or commendations to see my worth. She just needed her mother's scarred face to look at while she fell asleep every night. Driven by a fierce primal need to provide a better life for her, I pushed myself relentlessly. I transitioned out of the warehouse grind, leveraging my logistics experience and military efficiency record to eventually secure a highly stable position as a diligent logistics supply chain coordinator at a mid-sized shipping firm downtown. To my colleagues in the cubicles, I was just a highly efficient, somewhat stern 42-year-old widow who didn't engage in office gossip and always ate lunch alone at her desk. I intentionally wore baggy, unremarkable clothing and kept my head down, executing massively complex shipping routes across the country with absolute military precision. I earned their respect through undeniable competence, not through physical appearance or personal stories. Nobody in that mundane, fluorescent-lit office had the slightest clue about the prestigious combat medals hidden in the wooden lockbox in my closet at home, nor did they know about the obscenely wealthy, toxic media empire I had permanently walked away from. I was perfectly content being a ghost. Ghosts don't get interrogated. Ghosts don't get pitied. Ghosts just do their jobs and go home to the people who actually matter. I had successfully built a perfect, deeply isolated fortress in our small apartment for just the two of us. We spent our quiet evenings reading books on the worn sofa, Ava tucked into the crook of my arm, with her socked feet dangling over the cushion, entirely disconnected from the chaotic elite high society that had callously cast me out. Yet beneath the calm domestic surface, my ingrained tactical instincts always kept me slightly on edge. I constantly monitored our surroundings when we went to the park, scanning the perimeter of the playground before I let Ava run to the swings, fiercely guarding our quiet existence from any potential threats. Every single night before going to bed, I would manually check the heavy deadbolts on the front door, testing the resistance twice, then stand by the window to observe the dark street below for any unfamiliar vehicles. I cataloged the usual cars, a blue Honda, a white pickup, a dented minivan, anything new, and I noted the plates. This wasn't paranoia. It was the hardwired instinct of a soldier who understood from brutal personal experience that a peace, this beautiful and profound, was incredibly fragile. One phone call, one accidental encounter, one moment of carelessness, and the world I had built for Ava could shatter. I was mentally and physically prepared to defend our quiet life with lethal, unyielding determination. I just didn't know how soon that preparation would be tested. Escaping my family physically did not mean escaping their suffocating influence over the city. My sister's surgically contoured face was plastered absolutely everywhere. I would walk past downtown newsstands on my lunch break and see her pristine, artificially perfect smile beaming from the glossy covers of elite business and lifestyle magazines. The headlines were grotesque in their irony. One cover declared her a champion of family values and women's empowerment. I could smell the glossy synthetic ink from 3 feet away. Every single time I saw her publicly hailed as a philanthropic visionary, a cold, visceral wave of disgust washed over me so hard it tightened my stomach. I knew the monstrous reality behind that heavily manicured public image. I knew what she had said to me across that mahogany dining table. I knew about the guest house order and the demand to hide my face like it was something criminal. Whenever I passed those stands, I would grip my cheap frayed canvas tote bag tighter, quickly pulling my jacket collar up to hide the jagged scar on my cheek from passing strangers. I actively chose a simple life to bury the bleeding memories of the battlefield, to bury the pain of being rejected by my own family. I wanted nothing to do with her empire of lies, perfectly content to remain an invisible ghost in her sprawling city. She could have her glossy magazine covers. I had Ava. That was worth more than every corporation she controlled. Despite the lingering shadow of my family's empire looming over every street corner, I absolutely refused to let their ghost dictate my life or ruin my weekends with Ava. On a bright, crisp Saturday morning, I took my daughter to our favorite spot, Groundwork Cafe. It was a rare treat, a very small financial indulgence I carefully factored into my strict, tight weekly budget as a non-negotiable line item under sanity. I carried Ava on my hip, pushing my shoulder through the heavy brass-handled glass doors into the warm, bustling environment. The rich, bitter aroma of roasted espresso beans instantly filled the air, thick and dark and comforting. I navigated through the crowd and found our usual small circular table tucked away in the far corner against the exposed brick wall. I immediately positioned my chair so my back was firmly against the brick, my eyes scanning the main entrance and the emergency exits purely out of a deeply ingrained, unbreakable tactical military habit. 2 exits, one behind the service counter, one main, 18 patrons seated, 4 standing at the bar, clear sightlines to the door. I noted all of it before I even sat down. The cafe was unusually packed with the city's high society that morning. The space reeked of unbearable arrogance, heavy designer colognes clashing against one another, and the sharp clinking of expensive jewelry against ceramic cups. I completely ignored the condescending side eyes directed at my faded, worn-out denim jeans and my scuffed combat boots. The same boots I had polished and repolished 100 times until the leather was permanently warped into the shape of my feet. My entire focus was locked exclusively on Ava. I sat there calmly sipping my hot black coffee, offering a rare, genuine smile as I listened to her happily babble about her week. She was animatedly describing the colorful, messy drawings she had proudly pinned to her kindergarten classroom wall the day before, waving her small hands in the air to show me how big the sun was in her painting. For a few precious, uninterrupted minutes, the chaotic world outside our little corner table, the judgmental stares of the wealthy patrons and the looming trauma of my past simply ceased to exist in my mind. We were safe in our own perfect, impenetrable little bubble. My guard was down. Just for a moment. Just enough. But that beautiful peace shattered in a violent fraction of a second. Ava, completely overcome with innocent excitement about her story, swung her little arms wide to demonstrate exactly how big her drawing was. As her hand came down in a sweeping arc, her elbow clipped the edge of her heavy ceramic hot chocolate mug. The tall mug tipped over in agonizing slow motion, the dark liquid sloshing against the white rim. My ingrained combat reflexes instantly fired, my hand snapping out with blinding speed to catch it before it fell. But I was severely hindered by the awkward, cramped angle of the small table, my forearm wedged between the sugar dispenser and a stack of napkins. I was half a beat too slow. The heavy mug crashed onto the table edge with a sharp ceramic crack, and the dark, sticky, scalding liquid violently splashed through the air, landing directly on a limited edition, brightly colored designer handbag belonging to a woman passing right by our table. The chocolate soaked into the leather in an ugly, spreading stain. I immediately looked up to apologize, and the blood in my veins turned to solid, absolute ice. The woman glaring down at me, her mouth already open in a furious snarl, was Jessica. My sister recognized my scarred face instantly. The second her eyes locked onto mine, her perfectly contoured, camera-ready face twisted into a horrifying mask of absolute, unadulterated hatred. Recognition hit her like a physical blow, and instead of surprise, I saw 10 years of festering contempt detonate behind her eyes. She didn't care that a frightened 6-year-old child was involved. She didn't look at the spilled chocolate or the ruined bag. She looked at my scar, and she weaponized the trivial accident, immediately violently pointing her ruined, dripping leather bag directly at Ava's face, as if it were a loaded weapon. "Are you blind?" she shrieked, her voice hitting a piercing, shrill frequency that completely cut through the ambient cafe chatter like a police siren. "You failure, you parasite. Your mother is a useless woman and you are just inferior trash." Her cruel, venomous words echoed off the brick walls, silencing every conversation in the room. She was using this public stage to establish her absolute dominance over the sister she had always violently despised, and she was dragging a terrified child into the crossfire without a shred of hesitation. My body reacted purely on primal instinct before my conscious mind could even fully process the rage detonating behind my ribcage. I immediately lunged forward, folding my entire upper body over the small table to completely encompass Ava in my arms. I pressed her small, trembling head firmly against my chest, covering both of her ears with my calloused hands to physically block out the venomous, toxic poison spewing from her own aunt's mouth. I could feel Ava's rapid heartbeat hammering against my forearm like a trapped bird. My jaw locked so tightly my teeth ached, a sharp pain shooting up into my temple. I absorbed the hateful, judgmental stares of the dozens of wealthy patrons surrounding us, every single one of them frozen in their seats, acting as an impenetrable physical human shield for the only pure thing that mattered in my life. I rapidly assessed Ava, running my hand down her arm, checking her lap, ensuring the scalding hot liquid hadn't splashed onto her skin. She was dry. She was terrified, but she was unburned. That was all that mattered in that fraction of a second. Once I was absolutely certain Ava wasn't burned, I slowly, deliberately stood up straight. My spine snapped into a rigid, flawless, perfect military posture, my shoulders squared, my chin level. The exhausted, shabby, invisible civilian mother vanished into thin air, instantly replaced by the overwhelming, lethal, commanding presence of a Marine Corps captain who had faced far worse threats than a screaming socialite with a ruined handbag. I locked my cold eyes directly onto my sisters, displaying zero fear, zero panic, and absolutely zero submission. "I will pay the full amount to clean or replace this bag," I stated clearly, my voice low and level, each word measured and delivered with the crushing, undeniable weight of a direct battlefield command. "But first, you must apologize to my daughter for those words." I did not break eye contact. I did not blink. I was challenging the most powerful media mogul in the city to cross the absolute line I had just firmly drawn in the sand, and every person in that cafe could feel the temperature drop. My sister let out a harsh, theatrical, mocking laugh that echoed loudly off the brick walls, her head tilting back to expose the diamond choker around her throat. She looked me up and down with utter, undisguised revulsion, her eyes lingering deliberately on my faded jeans, my scuffed boots, the fraying collar of my flannel shirt. "Pay, with the cheap salary from your pathetic job. What gives you the right to demand an apology from me?" She spat aggressively, adjusting the lapels of her expensive designer coat, looking at me like I was a cockroach that had crawled out from under the baseboard. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I leaned in slightly, closing the physical distance between us by exactly 6 inches, enough to invade her space without touching her, and delivered my response with ice-cold surgical precision. "Because you just insulted a child who didn't mean to do anything wrong. You can insult me all you want, but apologize to my daughter right now." My absolute refusal to cower in front of her high society peers sent a visible ripple through the crowd. Chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the counter set down their cup. The barista stopped grinding beans. This was the point of no return, and every single person in that room knew it. If you've ever felt the crushing weight of a toxic family member trying to tear you down in public, please hit the like button right now. It takes a massive amount of strength to stand up to your own blood, so share your experiences in the comments below if you've ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace. My icy, unwavering defiance completely shattered my sister's fragile illusion of supreme control. Her face flushed dark mottled red with unhinged narcissistic fury, the veins in her neck visibly pulsing against her diamond choker. "You dare give me orders!" She roared, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling violently with rage as she yanked her heavy gold-plated smartphone from her designer pocket. She pointed a sharp acrylic fingernail mere inches from my scarred cheek, so close I could feel the displaced air on my skin. Her eyes were wide with madness. "You think you're someone, a mentally unstable crippled woman? I'll show you the price of insolence." She was no longer just yelling about a ruined handbag. The handbag was forgotten, a prop in a performance that had nothing to do with chocolate stains. She was actively trying to destroy the foundation of my entire existence. She wanted to crush the very spirit that had allowed me to survive without her wealth, and she was using her massive public platform right there in the middle of the crowded coffee shop to execute my character in front of witnesses. Without breaking her manic eye contact with me, she loudly and aggressively dialed her high-powered private legal team. In front of the dead-silent staring cafe, she weaponized her elite status with the practiced efficiency of someone who had destroyed people before. "Get Child Protective Services on the line right now," she screamed viciously into the phone, making sure every single person in the room could hear her. "I want full psychiatric evaluations. I will prove this violent, deranged veteran has severe PTSD. I will strip her of her custody rights and throw that child into the system forever." She used my brutal combat trauma, the very injuries I sustained defending my country, as a legal dagger aimed straight at my heart. She was fully prepared to fabricate medical evidence and buy off judges just to ensure I lost the only person I loved. The words, "throw that child into the system," hit me harder than any IED shrapnel ever could. I felt a sharp, desperate tug at my waist. Ava's tiny, cold hand was gripping the fabric of my cheap shirt so tightly the stitching strained under her small fingers. Her small frame was shaking violently in pure, unadulterated terror. A 6-year-old couldn't possibly grasp the complex legal threats and acronyms being screamed across the cafe, but she vividly, instinctively felt the imminent danger of being torn away from her mother. She pressed her face into my hip, and I could feel the wetness of her tears soaking through the denim. The blatant injustice threatened to rip my chest open. My vision tunneled the edges of the room, blurring into a gray haze as my combat instincts screamed at me to act, to close the distance and neutralize the threat with maximum force. I calculated the exact physical trajectory required to disarm her and shatter her phone against the floor, the angle of my elbow, the rotation of my wrist, the precise amount of pressure to snap the device from her grip. But I knew with absolute certainty that throwing a single punch would give her the exact, undeniable evidence she needed for CPS. One act of physical aggression and I would lose Ava forever. I squeezed Ava's hand tightly, aggressively grounding myself in absolute, immovable, tactical stillness. I breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The same breathing pattern I used before kicking in doors in Fallujah. My sister aggressively ended the phone call, stabbing the screen with her thumb and sliding the phone back into her pocket with a twisted, utterly triumphant smile of pure evil stretching across her contoured face. She honestly thought she had won. She firmly believed she had finally broken the crippled, stubborn sister who had dared to walk away from her empire 10 years ago. She crossed her arms over her chest and waited for me to crumble, to beg, to cry, to finally submit the way she had always wanted me to. I didn't blink. I stared right through her expensive designer clothes, her diamond jewelry, her flawless makeup, looking directly into her hollow, pathetic soul. I repeat, apologize to my daughter. That single, unflinching command, delivered in a voice so low it barely carried past the 2 feet between us, acted as a lit match thrown directly into a massive powder keg. My sister completely lost her mind. Her composure evaporated. Her face contorted into something feral and unrecognizable. She lunged forward with a furious, guttural scream and swung her open hand with every ounce of force in her body, delivering the merciless slap that cracked across my scarred cheek and severed our bloodline forever. picking up exactly in the frozen fraction of a second, where the echo of that slap was still ringing off the brick walls. John, the massive former Marine who had just stepped forward to violently execute his wife's ruthless order, completely broke down in front of the entire cafe. His broad muscular shoulders collapsed inward as if he had been struck by a physical blow from behind, his large hands tightly clenched into heavy fists, just moments ago coiled and ready to deliver whatever violence his wife demanded fell limply to his sides. They were trembling uncontrollably, his thick fingers twitching and grasping at empty air. He stumbled back exactly 3 steps, the heels of his expensive Italian loafers scraping clumsily against the hardwood floor. Impossible. Is that Captain Watson? He stuttered out, his massive chest heaving violently as he struggled to draw oxygen in the dead, silent room. He stared intensely at my heavily scarred face, and I could see it happening behind his eyes, the horrific suppressed memories crashing back in an uncontrollable flood. A burning Humvee, exploding IEDs tearing the road apart, the acrid choking smell of charred metal and burning fuel, the unbearable weight of a body being dragged through sand and rubble. Those memories clearly flashed across his wide, terrified eyes like a projector playing footage he had spent a decade trying to erase. The staggering realization that he was just ordered to physically attack the very savior who had pulled his bleeding, unconscious body from the wreckage of that burning vehicle completely short-circuited his brain. He was hyperventilating, his massive chest heaving violently as he struggled to draw oxygen in the dead, silent room. Not a single person moved. Not a single fork clinked against a plate. The entire cafe held its collective breath. My sister grabbed his arm aggressively, digging her acrylic nails into his tailored jacket so hard the fabric puckered under the pressure. She screamed at him to stop acting like a coward and deal with me, her voice cracking with fury and confusion because she couldn't understand why her obedient attack dog had suddenly frozen. But John violently shoved her hand away, ripping her grip from his sleeve with a force that made her stumble sideways in her heels. A look of absolute disgust crossed his face, directed not at me, but at the woman he had married. He whipped around to face his tyrannical wife, his face contorted in sheer agony, the cords of his neck straining against his collar. He screamed in a hoarse, shattered voice that violently shook the large glass windows of the cafe and made 3 people at the nearest table physically flinch. "Do you know who you just hit, huh? This is Captain Watson of the Marine Corps. She charged into a sea of fire in Fallujah in 2014. She used half her face to block shrapnel, just to drag my worthless life out." He pointed a trembling finger at my ruined cheek, his hand shaking so badly the gesture looked almost violent. The explosive revelation tore through the cafe like a shockwave from a detonation. The ultimate devastating face-slapping didn't come from my fists. It came from the agonizing, undeniable truth vomited out by her own husband in front of every single person she had ever tried to impress. The collective horrified gasp of the elite crowd sucked all the oxygen out of the room. My sister stood completely paralyzed, her mouth hanging open in sheer horror as her husband's brutal confession shattered her fabricated reality into a million razor-sharp pieces. Her carefully constructed empire of public perfection, her magazine covers, her philanthropic galas, her champion of family values brand, all of it was disintegrating in real time under the weight of a single undeniable truth. But following my absolute tactical rules, I refused to just stand passively while someone else defended me. I had never needed a man to fight my battles, not in Fallujah, and not in this cafe. I stepped carefully around the spilled hot chocolate pooling on the floor, deliberately closing the physical distance between my sister and me until I could see my own scarred reflection in her wide, terrified pupils. I leaned in, my voice dropping to an ice-cold, execution-style whisper that cut through her shock meant only for her ears. "You wanted to know the price of insolence, Jessica," I stated, my eyes boring relentlessly into her hollow soul, watching her mascara-smeared composure crumble in real time. "This is it. Your entire empire. Your wealth. Your perfect marriage. It is all built on the miserable life I saved. Now watch it burn." It was the ultimate active psychological kill shot that completely annihilated her ego, delivered without raising my voice above a whisper, without throwing a single punch, without shedding a single tear. The deadliest weapon in that room was the truth, and I had just detonated it, point blank. Movement caught the corner of my eye. From a small table near the back of the cafe, partially hidden behind a tall potted plant, a distinguished man in his mid-60s slowly pushed his chair back. Thomas Miller, a retired Navy colonel with silver-streaked hair and a rigid jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite, had quietly witnessed the entire horrific ordeal from start to finish. He stood up tall, his posture instantly transforming from a relaxed civilian enjoying his morning paper into a rigid, proud military stance, his heels snapping together with an audible click on the hardwood. Completely ignoring the chaotic murmurs of the wealthy civilians, the smartphone cameras being raised, and my sister's hyperventilating breakdown, he squared his broad shoulders and adjusted the collar of his plain cotton jacket. He raised his right hand sharply to his brow, executing a flawless, deeply solemn military salute in my direction, publicly honoring the immense sacrifice I had made on the battlefield. The profound silence of a veteran's respect drowned out every other sound in the cafe. The whispers stopped. The camera phones lowered slightly. For a single powerful moment, the room understood exactly what they were looking at. Not a scarred woman in cheap clothes. A decorated combat hero. I held his gaze firmly, my chin lifting just an inch, and gave a sharp tactical nod in return, acknowledging the unbroken brotherhood that my blood family could never understand, could never buy, and could never take away from me. John's earth-shattering confession acted exactly like a detonator on a much larger explosive. Emily Davis, a young freelance reporter sitting just 2 tables away from the epicenter of the explosion, had been filming on her smartphone from the very first moment my sister started screaming. She immediately shoved her phone high into the air, adjusting the angle to capture my sister's devastated face, and continued to record the explosive fallout. Her fingers tapped aggressively across her screen, uploading the unedited raw footage directly to her massive social media following in real time. The video went live while my sister was still standing there with her mouth open. The crowd in the cafe began to murmur loudly, pulling out their own phones to document the downfall, the metallic symphony of a dozen smartphone cameras clicking and recording filling the space. Before my sister could even begin to process her monumental humiliation, the heavy brass-handled cafe doors swung open with a gust of cold air. Patrol Officer Robert Smith marched straight through the crowd, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor having caught the commotion from his patrol car. "Who threw the strike?" he demanded, taking absolute control of the chaotic scene. Half a dozen patrons, including Emily, immediately pointed directly at my sister, shoving their smartphone screens toward the officer to show the crystal-clear footage of the physical assault. He quickly reviewed the undeniable evidence, stepped directly up to the Madam President of a media empire, and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The cold metallic click of the cuffs opening echoed through the silent room. "Ma'am, I need you to step outside with me. You are being charged with assault," he commanded, his voice flat and official, completely ignoring her frantic, hysterical threats to call the city mayor, the governor, and every other powerful contact stored in her phone. Panicking wildly as the officer grabbed her arm, my sister whipped her head toward John, silently begging her husband to use his immense corporate power to bail her out of the humiliation. Her eyes were wide and wet, her lips moving without sound, the wordless plea of a woman who had never once been told no in her entire adult life. But John slowly shook his head, his eyes filled with profound shame and disgust. Not disgust at me. Disgust at himself for standing beside her for this long, for staying silent about Fallujah, for letting her treat me like garbage for a decade while he wore the suit she bought him and cashed the paychecks from the company I had indirectly helped him survive to build. He stepped backward, physically separating himself from his wife with a deliberate visible gap of space, and positioned his massive frame like an impenetrable shield in front of me and Ava. He was choosing sides, publicly. Permanently. As the police escorted my disgraced, weeping sister out the door to the flashing blue and red lights of the squad car parked on the curb, I slowly crouched down to Ava's eye level. I wrapped my strong arms tightly around her trembling, small body, feeling her rapid heartbeat gradually begin to slow against my chest. I kissed her messy hair, inhaling the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. I pulled her close, whispering softly into her ear. "Everything is okay now, sweetheart. Nobody is going to take you away from me, I promise." She buried her face in my neck and held on like I was the only solid thing left in the world. And for her, I was. 4 grueling weeks later, the viral video had completely obliterated my sister's carefully curated media empire. Emily Davis's unedited footage had been viewed over 40 million times across every major social media platform. News outlets picked it up within hours. Commentary channels dissected every second of the confrontation. The massive PR crisis resulted in lost contracts, plummeting stocks, board members resigning in public statements, distancing themselves from her brand, and a total public boycott of every product and publication associated with her name. The large wood-paneled civil courtroom was dead silent when the hearing date finally arrived. I expected her to walk in flanked by a dozen expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers in matching charcoal suits. Instead, she stepped up to the defendant's podium entirely alone, her heels clicking unevenly on the marble floor. She looked gaunt, her cheekbones protruding sharply beneath skin that had lost its artificial glow. She was completely stripped of her designer armor and arrogant makeup, wearing a simple dark blouse that hung loosely on her diminished frame. Standing before the stern judge in his elevated black robes and looking directly across the room at me, my sister broke down in heavy, uncontrollable, ugly sobs. She publicly confessed to the court that her extreme cruelty was not born of superiority, but entirely from a pathetic, deep-seated jealousy of my unshakable resilience, and the honor she could never buy with all the money in the world. She admitted she had tried to destroy me because my strength exposed her weakness. My scars reminded her that real sacrifice existed and she had never made one. She begged the court for forgiveness, her voice cracking and breaking between every other word, legally accepting all punitive punishments, mandatory therapy, and massive financial damages, without a single argument from a single lawyer. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's bench, my posture rigid and straight, my hands flat on the polished wooden surface in front of me. I didn't smile in vindictive victory. I didn't hurl a single bitter insult back at her to kick her while she was down. I didn't perform for the cameras that lined the back of the courtroom. I simply looked at the utterly broken woman who used to be my sister, the same woman who had descended the staircase 10 years ago in a cloud of expensive perfume and ordered the butler to hide me from her guests. I gave a slow, deliberate nod, silently acknowledging her late, painful repentance. I didn't offer a dramatic hug or a tearful soap opera reconciliation. I didn't cross the courtroom to embrace her. I simply accepted her total surrender, firmly establishing a permanent, uncrossable boundary between our lives. The judge accepted her plea. The gavel came down with a heavy wooden crack. Justice was served, but the deep fracture in our bloodline would remain forever. Some things once shattered do not get repaired. They just get swept up and stored away in a place where they can no longer cut you. 3 quiet, uninterrupted months drifted by after the civil trial. My life with Ava successfully returned to its flawless, deeply peaceful rhythm, free from the suffocating shadow of my family's wealth and the constant threat of their reappearance. One crisp Saturday morning, I opened the front door to check the mail, the cool air hitting my face as I stepped onto the concrete stoop in my bare feet and cotton robe. A simple brown cardboard package was resting quietly on the welcome mat, slightly damp from the early dew. No return address. I brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter between the coffee maker and the fruit bowl, and carefully sliced the heavy packing tape open with my tactical pocket knife, the blade clicking open and shut with practiced precision. Nestled inside layers of protective bubble wrap was a pristine, highly detailed limited edition coloring book. I recognized it immediately. It was the exact expensive book that Ava had been mesmerized by in a downtown bookstore window several weeks before the horrific incident at the cafe. She had pressed her small hands against the glass and stared at it for a full 5 minutes, pointing at the detailed illustrations of castles and dragons before I gently pulled her away because it cost more than our weekly grocery budget. It was a deeply personal, incredibly observant gift meant entirely for the child they had terrified. Somebody had been paying very close attention to a moment I thought nobody else had noticed. Tucked neatly beneath the coloring book was a thick handwritten envelope made of heavy cream-colored cardstock. I pulled it out carefully, turning it over in my calloused hands. No printed labels, no corporate letterhead. Just a handwritten name on the front in shaky ink. I opened it and unfolded the pages inside. It was a long, detailed letter from my sister. The dark ink was visibly blurred in several places by obvious heavy teardrops that had warped the paper, causing the pen strokes to bleed outward in small, uneven circles. She detailed her deep, agonizing remorse in language stripped entirely of the corporate polish I had come to associate with every word she spoke. She wrote about the therapy sessions, the diagnosis, the confrontation with her own narcissism, the specific moments she remembered: the dining room, the guest house order, the staircase, and how each one now made her physically sick. Attached to the back of her letter, paperclipped to the final page, was a short, incredibly sincere note of eternal gratitude from John, written on a torn piece of plain-lined paper. He thanked me once again for Fallujah. He thanked me for dragging his bleeding body through the sand. He thanked me for the 10 years of life he got to live because of the half of my face I sacrificed. I stood alone in the quiet of my kitchen, reading the crooked handwriting, the coffee maker gurgling softly behind me. I didn't feel anger anymore. I genuinely felt the heavy, devastating sincerity of two deeply flawed people who had finally painfully learned the true catastrophic cost of their arrogance and cruelty. I didn't throw the letter away. I didn't burn it. I didn't frame it on the wall or paste it into a scrapbook. I walked slowly down the short hallway to my bedroom, my bare feet padding softly on the worn carpet, and opened the top drawer of my wooden dresser. I pulled out a heavy, solid oak lockbox, the same box I had carried in my duffel bag the night I walked out of my family's estate. I knew the combination by muscle memory. The brass latch clicked open. I carefully folded my sister's letter along its original creases and placed it gently inside the soft, velvet-lined interior. I rested the paper directly beside my silver star and purple heart medals, the metal cool and heavy against the back of my fingers as I adjusted the letter's position. To me, that tear-stained letter of genuine repentance was a massive spiritual victory. It represented a battle just as hard-fought and a peace just as precious as any commendation I had ever earned bleeding in the deserts of Fallujah. It was the absolute final closure I needed to put the war, both the military and the familial one, behind me for good. I closed the lid of the lockbox. The latch clicked shut with a sound of finality that echoed through the quiet bedroom. I slid the box back into the drawer and pushed it closed. Later that afternoon, I sat in the wooden rocking chair on my front porch, the old boards creaking softly under my weight with each slow, rhythmic push of my foot. A steaming mug of black dark roast coffee rested in my calloused hands, the ceramic warm against my palms, the rich, bitter aroma curling up past my chin. I watched with a soft, genuine smile as Ava sat cross-legged in the lush green grass of the small front yard, happily scribbling bright, wild colors into her new coloring book, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in fierce concentration. She was filling in a dragon with purple and gold crayon, completely ignoring the suggested color palette printed on the page, creating something entirely her own. The warm, golden hour sunlight filtered gently through the large oak trees lining the quiet street, casting long, soft shadows across the lawn. The light landed directly on my heavily scarred cheek, warming the thick, rigid tissue the way sunlight warms a stone. But as the light hit the jagged ridges and valleys of that old wound, it didn't look terrifying or grotesque anymore. Bathed in the warm setting sun, the massive scar looked truly radiant, a beautiful, undeniable proof of survival and strength. Ava looked up from her coloring book, caught me watching her, and flashed me a gap-toothed grin that reached all the way to her sparkling eyes. I raised my coffee mug slightly in her direction, a quiet toast to the life we had built together. There were no more brutal wars to fight. There was no more toxic family to endure. All that remained was an absolute peace. Sometimes the deepest scars we carry are the very things that prove our incredible strength and resilience. If this story reminded you of your own worth, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments, so please share how you've overcome the toxic forces in your own life and found your peaceful sunrise.